Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, we are not dealing with the polished monsters of Hollywood, with the neat silver bullets, the convenient full moons, or the neatly choreographed transformations. Instead, we're tracing something far older, stranger, and far less entertaining. The long, dark history of the werewolf myth. Before we follow those paw prints through ancient myth, famine-stricken villages, and the trial records of men who confessed to cannibalism under torture, do me one small favour. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. I've linked my favourite pair in the description. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. The modern werewolf is an oddly familiar figure. In films and novels, he has become a polished cliché, a man with suspiciously sharp cheekbones who transforms at the first sight of a full moon, sprouting fur in convenient time with swelling music, before prowling the streets in pursuit of prey. Hollywood has made him at once frightening and oddly glamorous. He is cursed, yes, but cursed in a way that leaves him photogenic, brooding, and doomed to a neatly scripted fate. The silver bullet ends his suffering with admirable efficiency. It is all very tidy. The older werewolf, however, was never tidy. He was not handsome under the fur, nor did he follow a cinematic schedule. He was unpredictable, terrifying, and above all, believed to be real. To a medieval villager living at the edge of a wolf-haunted forest, the idea of a man turning into a wolf was not an entertaining fiction. It was a genuine explanation for missing children, mauled livestock, or a body found half-eaten in the snow. The horror lay not in a transformation sequence, but in the conviction that your neighbour, the man who shared ale with you at market, might also be a beast that crept out at night to tear you apart. Wolves themselves were already a source of constant dread. For most of European history, they were more than distant symbols. They were daily threats. They prowled the outskirts of villages, raided flocks, and left their prints in the snow outside farmhouse doors. In an age when famine was a seasonal certainty and winters could kill more efficiently than swords, the wolf embodied the merciless forces of nature that stalked humanity. To imagine a man as wolf was to fuse the familiar danger of the human with the relentless hunger of the predator. This is where the werewolf first took hold, in the uneasy space between man and beast, neighbour and threat, hearth and forest. To understand how this figure emerged and why he endured, we must trace his trail through myth and history, from the ancient cults of Greece and Rome to the sagas of the North, and then onward into the forests, churches, and courtrooms of medieval Europe. What we find there is stranger, darker, and far less cinematic than Hollywood ever imagined. From the beginning of recorded myth, wolves have occupied a place both feared and revered, embodying the contradictions of predator and protector, destroyer, and divine messenger. In antiquity, the wolf was not a background creature of the wilderness, but a figure interwoven with human life. In regions where they roamed freely, hunting in packs and occasionally preying on livestock or children, wolves became a natural symbol of the thin line between civilization and savagery. To imagine the wolf as an emblem of death and hunger was inevitable. To imagine it as a creature bound up with gods and rituals was equally so. This dual role made the wolf an ideal canvas upon which ancient societies projected their anxieties, aspirations, and explanations for the violence that simmered within their own communities. The Greeks offered one of the earliest and most enduring myths of human transformation into a wolf in the story of King Lycaon of Arcadia. As the tale goes, Lycaon, in an act of breathtaking blasphemy, sought to test Zeus by serving him a dish of human flesh, sometimes said to be that of his own son. It was an offence so grotesque that Zeus struck him down, transforming him into a wolf as punishment. The detail mattered. Lycaon was not obliterated but remade, condemned to carry the shape of the beast most closely associated with feral hunger and moral depravity. In this myth, the werewolf was not simply a curse but a divine judgment, a physical manifestation of moral corruption. For the Greeks, the wolf form was not an accident, but the natural body of one who had surrendered to savagery. This story echoes a theme that would recur throughout history: the werewolf as an embodiment of cannibalism and inhuman appetite. Lycaon's crime was not merely murder, but the profanation of kinship and hospitality. To turn him into a wolf was to state, in mythic shorthand, that he had abandoned human society entirely. It also established the enduring link between the wolf and the act of eating human flesh, a link that would reappear centuries later in the trial records of accused werewolves in famine-stricken Europe. Yet in the Greek telling, the myth also carried a faint note of awe. Lycaon was punished, yes, but in becoming a wolf, he also joined the ranks of creatures that prowled the edges of the divine, feared for their power as much as for their hunger. The Romans inherited much from Greek traditions, but reshaped wolf lore to fit their own martial and political imagination. They too knew the wolf as a predator, but they also claimed it as a maternal symbol in the story of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome who were nursed by a she-wolf. In this myth, the wolf was not simply a beast, but a surrogate mother, both nurturing and fierce, bestowing the feral strength that would one day build an empire. This ambivalence carried into Roman stories of men who could become wolves. Writers such as Pliny the Elder recorded tales of Arcadian men who, through ritual, shed their human skins and took on lupine form for years at a time, prowling as beasts before eventually regaining their humanity. These accounts blurred the line between myth and ethnography, presented not as fairy tales, but as reports of strange customs among distant peoples. The Roman imagination was not limited to such stories. It also entertained the possibility that wolves could be companions to soldiers or symbols of Rome's ferocity in war. To march under the emblem of the wolf was to evoke not just strength but the terror of coordinated, merciless attack. The legions, like wolf packs, were disciplined, relentless, and devastating when loosed upon their enemies. Thus, while the Greeks had seen the wolf primarily as a punishment or curse, the Romans could also frame it as a civic and military ideal, a reminder that the line between barbarity and empire was perilously thin. Beneath these Greco-Roman myths, however, ran an older and broader current: the Indo-European traditions that linked wolves with bands of young men living outside society. Scholars have noted recurring patterns across cultures, from India to Ireland, in which adolescent males underwent initiation rites that, symbolically or literally, associated them with wolves. These were not the stable, land-holding adults of the village, but liminal figures, outcasts in training, warriors without homes. They lived on the edge of the community, sometimes raiding neighbours, sometimes serving as mercenaries, their behaviour marked by recklessness and violence. To call them wolfmen was not simply poetic, it was an acknowledgement that their liminal state, neither fully boy nor fully man, neither fully inside nor outside society, mirrored the wolf's existence at the threshold of the human world. These youthful warrior bands embodied both danger and necessity. On the one hand, they threatened the community with violence, theft, and disorder. On the other, they served as a crucible for martial skill, producing the hardened fighters who might one day defend the tribe. The wolf was their natural emblem because it encapsulated this duality. A wolf pack was cohesive, disciplined, and deadly. Yet each wolf was also a creature of hunger, compelled to take by force what it could not produce. To see young men as wolves was to recognize both their potential utility and their current threat. In this sense, the werewolf myth was not only a supernatural tale, but a social commentary, a way of naming and managing the restless energy of youth. In many Indo-European traditions, ritual confirmed this association. In some cases, initiates donned wolf skins or masks, enacting the transformation physically. In others, they underwent symbolic death and rebirth as wolves, severing ties with family and society until they proved themselves worthy of return. These rites were not quaint play acting, but solemn acknowledgements of the fragility of civilization's boundaries. To live as a wolf, even symbolically, was to cross into the wilderness, both literal and moral. When the youth returned, scarred and tested, he carried with him the mark of that liminality, a reminder that society was always one bad harvest or one violent raid away from dissolving into wolfish chaos. It is telling that across these cultures, wolves are rarely neutral. They are not imagined as simply another animal, like deer or cattle, but as something qualitatively different. The wolf is consistently the mirror held up to humanity at its most precarious moments, in hunger, in violence, in exile. In antiquity, the wolf was at once the predator outside the firelight and the alter ego of those who broke social bonds. Lycaon was punished by becoming what he already was in spirit. The Arcadian ritualists lived as wolves because their society needed them to embody that dangerous role before they could rejoin the community. Roman tales of long-term transformations preserved the unease that one could live as a wolf for years and still, somehow, return to human form, bringing back with him memories of the wilderness. These myths reveal not a fascination with fantasy for its own sake, but a set of cultural tools for understanding violence, estrangement, and survival. What binds all of these ancient stories together is their insistence that the line between man and wolf is not fixed but permeable. To the Greeks, that permeability was a divine punishment. To the Romans, it could be a heroic emblem. To the Indo-European tribes, it was a social necessity for managing youthful violence. In each case, the transformation was less about biology than about morality, identity, and belonging. To become a wolf was to step outside the fragile framework of human society, whether as criminal, exile, or initiate. The myth gave that passage a language, a form, and in some cases, a ritual. When we look at the ancient wolf shapeshifter, we do not see the neat Hollywood cycle of curse and cure, nor the tidy boundary of the full moon. Instead, we see a much messier picture: wolves as punishment for crime, wolves as symbols of ferocity, wolves as initiatory masks for restless youth. These were not the werewolves of B-movies, but cultural constructs deeply entwined with survival and social order. The fear they represented was not of special effects, but of hunger, violence, and the terrifying possibility that those closest to you could become beasts. It is from these ancient roots that later European traditions would grow. The wolfman of Arcadia, the warrior who lived outside society in lupine guise, and the Roman fascination with transformation would echo through medieval tales and theological debates. The wolf as both predator and social symbol endured long after wolves themselves were driven from many landscapes. When we move northward into Scandinavia, the wolf ceases to be merely a cautionary symbol of exile and becomes instead a source of deliberate power, harnessed through ritual, clothing, and battle frenzy. The Norse sagas and later accounts speak of the berserkers and the Ulfhednar, warriors who donned the skins of beasts before combat, as though in wearing the pelt they also summoned the ferocity of the animal itself. The berserkers are the more famous of the two, remembered for wearing bear skins and entering battle in a furious trance, but alongside them were the Ulfhednar, the wolf coats, who wrapped themselves not in the hide of the bear, but in that of the wolf. Both figures blurred the line between man and animal, but the wolf warriors embodied a more specific kind of wildness. Not the slow, lumbering strength of the bear, but the relentless, coordinated savagery of the pack. These men were said to fight without armour, relying on their heightened state of frenzy, their ritual identification with the wolf, and the terror they inspired in opponents. The image of half-naked warriors clad in wolf pelts, screaming and foaming at the mouth, hurling themselves at shield walls, is one that has understandably lingered in the imagination. To face one Viking was unpleasant enough. To face one who insisted that he was a wolf first and a man second was worse still. The Ulfhednar were terrifying not only for their ferocity, but for the way they disrupted the categories of battle. The human enemy you might hope to understand and anticipate. The wolf enemy, by contrast, fought with a chaos and cruelty that seemed more than human. These warriors were closely associated with Odin, the god of wisdom, war and death, who himself was often accompanied by wolves. Odin's two beasts, Geri and Friki, were said to sit at his side, consuming the flesh of his sacrifices. To fight as an Ulfhedin was therefore not only to adopt the tactics of the wolf, but also to claim divine sanction, to say that one's fury in battle was an extension of the All-Father's own savage wisdom. This association with Odin lent a religious dimension to their transformation. The Ulfhednar were not merely pretending at being wolves, they were ritually stepping into a role sanctioned by their god, moving between the human and the animal with a spiritual legitimacy that gave their howls and frenzy greater weight than mere theatrics. Contemporary sources, fragmentary though they are, describe their condition as one of frenzy, where pain was dulled, reason suspended, and violence heightened. Some later scholars have attempted to explain this state in terms of hallucinogens, ritual intoxication, or even genetic predisposition toward epilepsy. But the essential fact is that, to their contemporaries, these men were believed to embody the wolf. They were feared not because they were misunderstood, but because everyone understood precisely what they meant to represent: the collapse of the boundary between warrior and beast. In a society where wolves hunted at the margins of farms and forests, the image of a man who could willingly assume their form and tactics was both impressive and horrifying. It is worth noting that in the sagas, the Ulfhednar are not always heroes. They are sometimes described as Odin's chosen warriors, but at other times they appear as bandits, marauders, or enemies who threaten the very communities that valued them in war. Their liminality was never resolved. They were both necessary and dangerous, admired and feared. The wolf skin was not a costume that could be easily set aside. It left a residue of suspicion, a sense that once a man had been a wolf in battle, he might remain one at heart even in times of peace. Here again, we see the continuity with the broader Indo-European traditions. Young men cast into the liminal space of wolfishness, useful when violence was required, troubling when it was not. The Ulfhednar also underscore the symbolic richness of the wolf in Norse cosmology. Wolves appear everywhere in their myths. The monstrous Fenrir destined to devour Odin at Ragnarok, Skjöll and Hati chasing the sun and moon across the sky, Odin's own companions Geri and Freki. To be a wolf was not only to be a predator, it was to be bound up with cosmic narratives of fate, destruction, and divine appetite. Thus the Ulfhednar were not merely playing at being wild animals, they were inserting themselves into a mythic framework that stretched from the battlefield to the end of the world. The wolf was both omen and ally, and by wearing its skin, a man declared himself aligned with forces far beyond the ordinary. Accounts of these warriors speak of their capacity to terrify both allies and enemies. To fight alongside an Ulfhedin must have been unnerving, for their frenzy was not easily directed. Like wolves, they fought with a kind of loyalty to the pack, yet their fury might spill out unpredictably. Saga literature is filled with episodes where berserkers or wolf-coated men are celebrated for their victories, but later become threats themselves, demanding tribute or turning their violence inward. The pelt that empowered them on the battlefield made them suspect of it, and this lingering ambiguity is a theme that echoes through werewolf lore more broadly. The difficulty of re-domesticating the man who has embraced the beast. The wolf coat, then, was not simply a garment, it was a liminal skin, marking the wearer as someone who had stepped outside the human condition. To put on the hide was to acknowledge the thinness of the veil between man and beast, and to announce to the community that one had crossed it deliberately. For the warrior himself, the act was transformative. For those who watched, it was terrifying. In this sense, the Ulfhednar were walking embodiments of the broader European anxiety about wolves, necessary, fascinating, and impossible to trust fully. Modern scholarship has sometimes attempted to strip away the mythic elements and interpret the Ulfhednar in purely practical terms, as elite shock troops who use ritualized frenzy to enhance their effectiveness. While there may be some truth in this, such explanations miss the essential cultural meaning of their lupine identity. The Norse themselves did not describe them as mere soldiers with unusual tactics, but as men who became wolves, who fought with lupine ferocity under Odin's patronage. To reduce them to military pragmatism is to forget the symbolic world in which they lived, where the wolf was both terror and divine omen. Their identity was not only a battlefield tactic, but a cosmological statement. What we glimpse in these Norse traditions is a crystallization of themes that had run through earlier Indo-European cultures. The wolf as the emblem of youthful warriors, the ritual donning of the skin, the blurring of human and animal. All these motifs find their most vivid expression in the Ulfhednar. But here, in Scandinavia, they acquire a darker and more explicitly mythic cast tied to gods, fate, and the cosmic wolves of Ragnarok. The Ulfhednar remind us that the boundary between man and wolf was never purely one of fear or punishment. It could also be one of deliberate embrace, of choosing to become the beast in order to wield its power. The legacy of these wolf-coated warriors endured not only in saga literature, but in the broader imagination of Europe. To later chroniclers, the Ulfhednar exemplified the terrifying possibility of transformation, a possibility that would bleed into the werewolf myths of later centuries. Yet the Norse were unique in ritualizing it so openly, in celebrating rather than merely fearing the man who became wolf. It is this combination of admiration and dread that makes the Ulfhednar so distinctive within the history of shape-shifting lore. And so, as we trace the path of the werewolf myth forward, we leave behind these Scandinavian battlefields where men in wolf pelts howled under Odin's gaze, straddling the line between human society and the wilderness. Ahead lies the broader tapestry of Celtic and early European folklore, where wolves shed their martial association and became instead the outcasts and cursed figures of story. Men and families condemned not to glory in battle, but to exile at the edges of the human world. In the Irish and Welsh traditions, the werewolf was not a hero of battle frenzy, but a figure driven beyond the pale of society, marked by curse or misfortune. These stories did not usually celebrate the strength of the wolf, so much as they lamented the sorrow of those condemned to wear its shape. To the Celts, the wolf was not only a symbol of ferocity, but also of liminality. It haunted the edges of villages and forests, appearing neither wholly inside the human world nor entirely outside it. To be transformed into a wolf was therefore to be cast into a shadowed state, suspended between belonging and erasure. Irish folklore preserves several accounts of men and families cursed to live as wolves for set periods of time, most famously 7 years. In one story recorded by Gerald of Wales in the 12th century, a priest encounters a pair of wolves in the woods who astonish him by speaking in human voices. They reveal themselves as a man and a woman from Ossory, condemned by St. Natalis to take on lupine form every 7 years as punishment for ancestral sins. At the end of their allotted time, they would return to human form, and others from their kin would assume the wolf shape in their stead. This tale blends Christian motifs of penance and generational guilt with older folkloric elements of transformation and cyclical exile. The idea of rotation of one family bound to this affliction across time emphasizes the inescapability of the curse. It is not the sin of one individual, but the inheritance of an entire lineage, condemned to spend part of its existence in the guise of the beast most feared by their neighbours. Such stories capture a crucial dimension of Celtic and early European wolf lore, the sense that the wolf state was not only a punishment, but also a condition of marginality. To become a wolf was to be removed from the hearth, from the field, from the community, and to be forced to inhabit the liminal spaces of forest and moor. In Irish tradition, those who transformed often retained their human reason and voice, which made the experience all the more tragic. They were not mindless beasts, but thinking exiles doomed to live as predators while remembering their place among humans. This tension between human consciousness and animal form anticipates later European tales in which werewolves plead their innocence or lament their condition, begging for recognition of their humanity even as their bodies betray them. The Welsh tales preserve similar themes, linking wolf transformation with punishment or misfortune rather than deliberate choice. One account tells of men transformed into wolves by a saint for their sins, echoing the Irish story in which sanctity and curse intertwine. In these stories, transformation was a way of enacting divine justice or social exclusion. The wolf became a vessel for expressing moral lessons. Disobedience, hubris, or wickedness resulted not in abstract condemnation, but in literal, bestial exile. To be made into a wolf was to have one's humanity stripped publicly, leaving the offender to prowl the margins until the curse was lifted or the penance served. What is striking in these traditions is the way the wolf functions as the embodiment of liminality itself. Wolves, after all, rarely appeared in the heart of settlements. They lived at the edge of fields and forests, visible in the distance, heard in howls at night, their presence always hovering at the boundary of the human domain. To become a wolf in story was therefore to embody the condition of being permanently at the edge, neither fully excluded nor safely included, neither human nor wholly animal. The cursed man lived in this suspended state, a walking reminder of the fragile boundary that separated the village from the wilderness. This sense of liminality distinguishes the Celtic werewolf from the martial Ulfhednar. Here, wolfhood is not a mask of chosen ferocity, but a symbol of estrangement. Such estrangement carried with it misfortune. Wolves in Irish and Welsh traditions are rarely depicted as fortunate or blessed. They are figures of sorrow, loss, and danger. To be condemned to the wolf shape was not to gain power, but to forfeit home, hearth, and community. The afflicted might wander for years, avoiding hunters and seeking scraps, existing in a twilight world where their humanity persisted internally but could find no outward expression. In this way, the Celtic wolfman embodies the pathos of exile more than the thrill of transformation. He is tragic rather than terrifying, an image of what it means to be banished into a form that denies recognition while never erasing memory. At the same time, these stories illustrate the enduring human need to find meaning in misfortune. A sudden death, a madness, a crime that seemed inexplicable, all could be explained by the intervention of a curse that condemned men to live as wolves. To say that one's neighbour had been transformed was to weave his misdeeds into a cosmic narrative, one that made sense of suffering by placing it within a framework of justice, however bleak. The wolf was not random chaos, but punishment embodied. In this way, folkloric werewolves served as communal lessons, reminders of divine authority, ancestral guilt, or the cost of transgression. Yet not all Celtic wolf lore was entirely punitive. Some tales suggested that those transformed could still display hospitality, wisdom, or virtue even in their wolf shape. The ossuary wolves encountered by Gerald of Wales were not rabid killers, but articulate beings seeking the sacrament of the Eucharist. Such stories complicate the stark division between man and beast, suggesting that the wolf shape, while a punishment, did not erase the essential humanity within. This ambiguity resonates through later werewolf traditions, where the creature is not always wholly monstrous, but sometimes a tragic figure, torn between two natures. It is significant, too, that these Celtic tales locate the wolfman at the periphery, the literal edge of the human landscape. Wolves did not thrive in the cultivated heartlands. They haunted the uncultivated margins. So too did the cursed men and families, condemned to exist in those liminal spaces where human law faltered and supernatural justice seemed most likely to intrude. To be a wolf was to belong to that outer zone, to the threshold between known and unknown, civilization and wild. The stories thus reinforce the social geography of the medieval imagination. At the centre lay the ordered village, protected by custom and law. At the margins lurked wolves, both four-legged and cursed, reminding everyone of the consequences of falling outside the circle of belonging. One cannot help but see in these tales echoes of older Indo-European motifs, refracted through Celtic Christianity and local folklore. The warrior bands that once lived at the edge of society, donning wolf masks as symbols of their liminal condition, seem to have left behind their shadows in these cursed families. But where once wolfhood had been a temporary rite of passage, in the Celtic imagination it became a sentence of punishment, imposed not by the tribe but by saints and gods. The function remained the same, to dramatise the precariousness of the boundary between human and animal, insider and outsider. Yet the meaning shifted from initiation to exclusion, from potential reintegration to permanent stigma. The broader European traditions echo these Celtic patterns, reinforcing the wolf's role as a symbol of exile and misfortune. Stories circulate of men who are said to have been turned into wolves for their sins, of communities haunted by rumours of families living under such curses, of individuals glimpsed in the woods with wolfish traits. The consistency of these tales suggests that the wolf had become a ready metaphor for social marginality across Europe. It was the figure used to express what it meant to fall outside the protection of community, whether through sin, misdeed, or ill fortune. To be made a wolf was to be branded as other, condemned to the edge. These folkloric currents prepared the ground for what would come later, when institutional religion sought to reinterpret and regulate such beliefs. For the medieval church, the wolf was not merely a folkloric figure of exile, but an allegory of sin, temptation, and heresy. The Celtic and early European traditions provided a reservoir of stories, of cursed families, of punished men, of wolves haunting the periphery that could be drawn upon and reshaped for theological ends. The wolf that once embodied liminality in folklore would, under the eye of preachers and theologians, become a didactic symbol of moral corruption and spiritual danger. When the Christian church took hold across Europe, it inherited not only landscapes of forests and wolves, but also the older pagan stories in which men and families were condemned to the wolf shape. These tales could not be entirely eradicated. They were too deeply woven into local imaginations and too useful in explaining misfortune. Instead, the church reinterpreted them through its own moral lens, recasting the wolf as a living allegory of sin. Sermons, saints' lives, and monastic chronicles began to use the wolf not simply as a predator of flocks, but as the devil's chosen image, a figure that embodied temptation, heresy, and corruption. In doing so, the church gave theological structure to the fears that already haunted the villages. To be wolfish was no longer merely to be liminal or cursed, it was to be spiritually diseased, a threat not only to the community, but to the very health of the soul. Preachers seized upon the wolf with enthusiasm, for it made a convenient image when addressing flocks both literal and metaphorical. Christ in the Gospels had already spoken of false prophets who came in sheep's clothing but inwardly were ravening wolves. This passage became a touchstone, allowing priests to describe sin and heresy as lupine threats that prowled around the faithful, waiting to devour the unwary. To compare a wayward member of the community to a wolf was not simply a rhetorical flourish, it placed that individual in league with the devil himself, identified as one who would rend and scatter the flock of Christ. Wolves thus ceased to be merely natural dangers and became moral ones, the embodiment of the church's warnings about straying from orthodoxy. Monastic writers extended the image in their chronicles, weaving wolves into accounts of miracles and moral lessons. A hagiographer might describe a saint who tamed or banished wolves to demonstrate divine authority over both nature and sin. Such stories did double duty. They reassured the faithful that holiness could overcome even the most terrifying predators, while simultaneously reminding them that wolves represented more than animals. They were shadows of the spiritual enemy, reminders that Satan prowled just as wolves did. To tell of a monk confronted by wolves in the forest was therefore never only a nature story, it was a meditation on the struggle against temptation and the vigilance required to maintain purity. This moralization of the wolf fed directly into the way folkloric werewolves were understood. The man condemned to wear a wolf's skin was no longer seen merely as unfortunate or cursed. He became a warning of what happens when one consorts with sin. If wolves symbolized the devil's hunger, then men who became wolves were examples of what befell those who surrendered to it. The folk tales of families condemned to wolfhood for generations dovetailed neatly with the church's emphasis on ancestral sin and the consequences of spiritual corruption. In the pulpit and the written word, these tales became cautionary exemplar, instructing the faithful to remain obedient lest they too be transformed. If not in body, then in soul. The allegorical power of the wolf was sharpened further by the church's constant struggle with heresy. To accuse heretics of being wolves was to paint them as predators disguised within the flock, dangerous precisely because they looked outwardly human while harbouring bestial appetites within. The Cathars, Waldensians, and other dissenting groups could be condemned not merely as doctrinally errant, but as lupine threats, ravenous and cunning. In this way, the language of wolfishness became a tool for demonizing opponents and justifying their suppression. It was far easier to call one's enemies wolves than to grapple with the uncomfortable possibility that they might simply be sincere but mistaken Christians. The wolf allowed the church to draw a bright line. Here is the flock, and there are the wolves. The task of the shepherd is to drive them out, or destroy them. This process also affected how ordinary crimes were interpreted. Theft, murder, or cannibalism could all be framed as symptoms of wolfishness. Not merely failures of morality, but eruptions of bestial corruption. When famine or violence struck, the temptation to blame the wolf within was strong. To say that a murderer was in fact a werewolf was to explain his savagery in terms of spiritual collapse, rather than human depravity. The Church's interpretation allowed communities to view crime and misfortune as signs of the devil's activity, to be countered with prayer, ritual, and, increasingly, judicial action. What had once been folkloric motifs of cursed transformation now became evidence in sermons and confessions, reshaped into tools of discipline. In homiletic literature, the wolf was often contrasted with the shepherd, a figure of Christ, but also of the priest himself. The shepherd protected, guided, and nurtured. The wolf deceived, tempted, and destroyed. This stark opposition gave preachers a vivid image for their listeners. To stray from the sacraments, to neglect confession, or to challenge the authority of the Church was to wander toward the wolves at the forest's edge. Here, the natural fear of wolf packs was deliberately grafted onto the spiritual fear of damnation. The wolf ceased to be a creature of chance encounters in the woods and became the constant companion of disobedience. This was a remarkably efficient arrangement. The wolf supplied ready-made sermons, terrifying enough to capture attention, yet familiar enough to resonate with lived experience. A preacher did not need to invent horrors. He could simply point to the howling outside the village and remind his flock that such sounds were metaphors for sin. It was perhaps one of the few occasions in which wolves performed a useful service for the Church, unpaid assistance in the work of pastoral instruction, their very existence furnishing the clergy with endless material. Yet this theological framing had darker consequences. Once the wolf was firmly established as an emblem of sin and the devil, those accused of consorting with wolves or embodying them were no longer pitiable exiles but dangerous heretics. The transformation from folklore to theology to legal persecution was gradual but inevitable. If wolves were symbols of heresy, then alleged werewolves could be prosecuted not merely as oddities but as agents of Satan. The folkloric man cursed into wolf form could now be treated as a criminal, evidence of the devil's work in the world. What had once been stories told on winter nights became grounds for charges, confessions, and executions. By the later Middle Ages, this trajectory was well established. The Church had created a framework in which wolves and wolfmen were no longer merely tales of misfortune or liminality, but direct reflections of the devil's activity. Allegory hardened into accusation. Where earlier generations might have pitied or marvelled at cursed families, later courts and inquisitors saw evidence of heretical corruption. The werewolf became not just a metaphor, but a legal problem. To be accused of wolfish transformation was to be placed in the same category as witches, sorcerers, and heretics, those who threatened not only individuals, but the entire order of Christendom. And it is here, in this fusion of folklore and theology, that the stage was set for the werewolf trials. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the werewolf had stepped fully from the pages of folklore and the pulpits of sermons into the legal archives of Europe. What had once been a tale to frighten children, or a moral allegory for wandering souls, was now grounds for accusation, prosecution, and execution. In France and Germany in particular, courts found themselves presiding over lurid cases in which men, and sometimes women, were accused not only of consorting with wolves, but of becoming them. These trials are among the strangest episodes of early modern Europe, for they reveal a society willing to blur myth and law, willing to treat stories of shape-shifting as evidence of crime. They also exposed the degree to which famine, war, and fear made even the most fantastical accusations seem plausible, turning rumour into indictment and confession into spectacle. The most infamous of these cases remains that of Peter Stubbe, the so-called Werewolf of Bedburg, tried and executed in Germany in 1589. Stubbe was accused of a catalogue of horrors that would have been implausible were it not for the desperation of his time. According to the charges, he confessed to a quarter-century of wolfish crimes, murdering men, women, and children, feasting on human flesh and engaging in incestuous liaisons with his daughter. He allegedly accomplished his transformations with the aid of a magical belt given by the devil himself, which allowed him to shed his humanity and take on the form of a ravening wolf. The story reads like a Gothic fantasy, and yet it was treated with the utmost seriousness by the authorities of Cologne. His trial ended in execution by breaking wheel and beheading, a punishment staged with public relish to drive home the message that wolfish sin would be met with the full weight of justice. The Stubbe case illustrates the way such trials were less about proof than about performance. The magical belt was never produced. The evidence consisted largely of his own tortured confession and the testimony of neighbours eager to rid themselves of a man who had long been viewed with suspicion. Here the dry historian may allow himself one raised eyebrow. Nothing says justice quite like extracting a confession by stretching a man until he agrees that, yes, he once ate his neighbour while wearing a fur belt. Yet the authorities were less concerned with logic than with demonstrating their resolve. To kill Stubbe as a werewolf was to assure the community that chaos could still be contained, that the devil's servants would not go unpunished. Stubbe was far from unique. In France, the late 16th century saw a rash of werewolf trials, particularly in the regions of Franche-Comté and Auvergne. Here too, men were accused of prowling as wolves, killing children and feasting on their flesh. One case from Dole in 1573 involved Gilles Garnier, a hermit accused of murdering several children. Witnesses testified that they had seen him in wolf form, and under torture he admitted to using an ointment that allowed him to transform. Garnier's case reveals the continuity of folkloric elements, the magical salve, the predation upon children, the wolf form that masked human guilt. He was burned at the stake, the execution as much an act of reassurance for the populace as a punishment for the accused. Other French cases follow similar patterns, blending local rumour with formal judicial procedure. In Poligny, a group of suspected werewolves were tried together, accused of feasting on children in the forests. In Burgundy, men confessed to hunting as wolves under cover of night. Always, the confessions were extracted under duress. Always, the crimes were amplified to monstrous extremes. Cannibalism recurs as a central theme, as if to confirm that the wolf man was not merely a murderer but a violator of the most basic human taboos. Eating human flesh placed the accused outside the pale of humanity entirely, aligning him more closely with the devil's beasts than with his own kind. The German trials were no less sensational. Beyond Stubbe, there were scattered cases in which men were accused of killing cattle or children under lupine disguise. Chroniclers delighted in repeating the details, filling pamphlets with gory imagery that circulated widely among readers eager for tales of horror. These pamphlets played a role not unlike that of modern tabloids or crime dramas, transforming local tragedies into cautionary stories of supernatural menace. In an age when literacy was growing and print could carry rumour across borders, the werewolf became both a local terror and a pan-European fascination. Behind these stories lay the machinery of torture. The early modern courtroom was not a neutral space for weighing evidence, but a theatre of pain designed to produce confessions that confirmed communal expectations. When a man was accused of being a werewolf, he was expected to admit to lurid crimes, to name accomplices, to describe the ointments, belts, or pacts with the devil that enabled his transformations. Under the pressure of the rack or the screw, most did. Their words, recorded by scribes, gave judges the justification they sought, and the executioner the authority to kill. In this way, folklore was not merely preserved but manufactured, each confession adding new details that would feed later accusations. The cultural fascination with cannibalism in these trials speaks to deeper anxieties. Europe in the 16th century was scarred by famine, war, and plague. Stories of people resorting to cannibalism in extremity circulated widely, and the werewolf became a symbolic means of displacing these horrors onto an otherworldly figure. To say that a hermit in the woods had killed and eaten children as a wolf was to avoid acknowledging that ordinary villagers might do the same in desperate times. The werewolf thus became a scapegoat for the community's darkest fears, embodying the possibility that hunger could strip away civilization and reveal only beastliness beneath. It is telling that the majority of those accused were marginal figures, hermits, beggars, or men already distrusted by their neighbours. These were individuals who lived at the edge of the village, both geographically and socially, and thus could be easily imagined as slipping further into the wilderness. Their outsider status made them ideal vessels for communal anxieties, the wolf shapes serving as a metaphor for their estrangement. The trials were therefore not only about alleged crimes, but about policing the boundaries of society, reaffirming who belonged within the community and who could be cast out as beastly. If someone strange lived at the edge of the woods and children went missing, the simplest course of action was not to improve security or consider human malice, but to conclude that the hermit was clearly a wolf in disguise. In this way, the legal system confirmed the village gossip, while torture confirmed the legal system, and execution confirmed the authority of both. The entire cycle reinforced itself, producing not justice, but reassurance. The community could believe that evil had been contained, even if the real causes of hunger and violence remained unresolved. Public executions of werewolves were intended as spectacles. Stubber's death by wheel and beheading was staged with gruesome ceremony, his body displayed as a warning. French burnings likewise drew crowds who came not only to witness justice, but to reassure themselves that the terror prowling the forests had been destroyed. These executions did not eliminate wolves, of course, nor did they prevent further crimes, but they satisfied a psychological need. By killing the accused werewolf, the community enacted a ritual cleansing, burning not only the body of the condemned, but the anxieties that had animated the trial. Pamphlets and chronicles ensured that these cases reached audiences far beyond the villages where they occurred. Readers devoured the details, from Stubbe's magical belt to Garnier's ointment, and in doing so helped to spread and standardise the motifs of the werewolf myth. The trials thus did not merely reflect folklore, they shaped it. Each execution added to the corpus of stories, ensuring that future accusations would draw upon familiar tropes. The werewolf of the 16th century was therefore both a product of ancient tradition and a creation of early modern legal and print culture, forged in the crucible of torture, rumour, and execution. By the 17th century, werewolf trials had become less common, supplanted by the larger witch hunts that swept Europe. Yet their legacy endured, for the categories and images developed in these cases would echo long afterward. The werewolf had been fully integrated into the repertoire of the devil's servants, alongside witches and heretics, and the stories of cannibalism, belts and ointments persisted in popular imagination. What these trials demonstrate above all is the extent to which social crisis could give shape to myth, transforming it into judicial reality. The werewolf trials of France and Germany cannot be understood in isolation from the material conditions of the 16th and 17th centuries. Europe in this period was not only racked by religious wars and political upheavals, but was also battered by climate and famine. Historians speak of the Little Ice Age, a period of lowered temperatures and erratic weather that disrupted harvests and made winters particularly harsh. Crops failed repeatedly, livestock perished, and communities found themselves perpetually on the edge of starvation. In such a context, wolves were more than metaphors. They were genuine competitors for food, prowling closer to settlements as hunger drove them from the forests. To accuse a man of becoming a wolf was therefore not simply to indulge in fantasy, but to articulate fears rooted in lived experience. In a world where hunger pressed constantly at the door, and the howl of wolves was an audible reminder that survival itself was precarious, it is in this setting that the theme of cannibalism became so central to werewolf accusations. When Peter Stuber, or Gilles Garnier, confessed to feasting on the flesh of children, they were not merely inventing grotesque stories under torture. They were voicing a collective nightmare that lay close to the surface of famine-stricken communities. Rumours of cannibalism spread quickly in times of shortage, as desperate acts were whispered about and amplified by fear. To speak of werewolves devouring children was to displace these whispers onto a figure already marked as monstrous, to give form to the terror that hunger might strip away every boundary of humanity. If a man could become a wolf, then perhaps his cannibalism was not evidence of ordinary human depravity, but of something darker, something supernatural. The wolf form allowed society to distance itself from the thought that neighbours, kin, or even oneself might in extremity turn to such acts. Accounts from these trials often emphasise not just the killings, but the gruesome details of consumption. Entrails devoured raw, limbs gnawed like bones left to dogs, warm blood drunk as if it were wine. Such details read today like the hyperbolic fancies of inquisitors and pamphleteers, but they were consistent with the anxieties of famine. Starving people imagined in vivid detail what it might mean to eat flesh because the prospect was not unthinkable, but terrifyingly close. Cannibalism lurked as the last resort of hunger, and the werewolf myth allowed these fears to be projected outward. The wolfman was accused of what the starving community most dreaded, thereby allowing them to condemn in another what they feared might lurk within themselves. This displacement was psychologically convenient. To admit that famine could drive ordinary men and women to acts of cannibalism would have been intolerable, for it would have exposed the fragility of the moral order. Better, then, to believe that such acts were the work of men who were not truly men, of beasts who had shed their humanity and joined the wolves. By constructing the figure of the werewolf, communities preserved a sense of their own decency. Hunger might gnaw at them, but they could reassure themselves that even in extremity they were not like those creatures who prowled the woods. The wolf, in this sense, became a scapegoat for human desperation, a vessel into which society poured its darkest possibilities so that it need not acknowledge them as its own. The connection between famine and werewolf panic is underscored by the timing of the trials. Many of the most infamous cases coincided with years of acute shortage, when hunger made people suspicious of their neighbours and fearful of predators. In such times, any unexplained disappearance could trigger rumours of wolfmen. Children who vanished while foraging, travellers who failed to return, livestock found slaughtered. All could be interpreted as evidence of lupine menace. The hunger of wolves and the hunger of men became indistinguishable in the imagination, both threatening to dissolve the boundaries of civilization. The werewolf trial was thus not only a judicial proceeding, but also a ritual performance of denial, a way of asserting that humanity remained intact, even as desperation suggested otherwise. It is important to note, however, that the werewolf was not always a figure of total otherness. In some accounts, the accused maintained that they had been compelled to their acts by external forces, by curses, by the devil, or by enchantments. These claims reveal an underlying ambivalence. If hunger could make beasts of men, then perhaps men could not be fully blamed for succumbing to it. The idea of transformation provided a language of partial exculpation, a way of acknowledging horror without placing it entirely within human responsibility. The wolf shape, in this sense, functioned both as condemnation and as excuse, allowing communities to externalize guilt while still punishing those marked as transgressors. The wolf-human divide, therefore, was not as absolute as it might appear. Rather, it was a shifting boundary that communities drew and redrew according to circumstance. In times of plenty, the wolf could be simply a predator, its menace contained in folklore. In times of famine, the wolf became a mirror of humanity's own hunger, its shape invoked to describe what it meant to cross the last taboo. Men accused of werewolf crimes were thus both scapegoats and symbols, their supposed transformations expressing collective fears about the instability of human identity itself. To be accused of wolfishness was to be placed on the far side of that fragile line, to be marked as one who had surrendered to appetites that society could not acknowledge as its own. There is a grim consistency in how frequently the charges centred on the bodies of children. Children were the most vulnerable in famine, the first to starve, and the least likely to survive harsh winters. They were also, in a tragic sense, the most plausible victims for tales of predation. To say that a werewolf had taken children was to put words to the community's most acute anxieties, to explain why the small graves multiplied so quickly. The wolfman became an explanation for the unendurable, his appetite standing in for the silent harvest of hunger. In condemning him, the community condemned the spectre of famine itself, staging a drama in which the beast responsible could be identified, punished, and destroyed, even as the true enemy remained the weather, the crops, and the grinding inevitability of shortage. These themes extended beyond trial records into popular imagination. Ballads, pamphlets, and chronicles retold the tales of wolfmen with relish, dwelling on the details of consumption and horror. The fascination reveals the paradox at the heart of the myth. It repelled and reassured at the same time. To hear of a werewolf tearing children apart was to shudder in horror, yet also to feel comforted that such horrors were the work of something alien, something that could be hunted and killed. The wolfman was thus both a nightmare and a solution, embodying fears while also providing a ritual means of containing them. From a modern perspective, the logic seems cruelly circular. Starvation bred rumours of cannibalism. Cannibalism was displaced onto werewolves. Accusations led to trials, and executions reassured the community that order had been restored. Yet famine persisted, and wolves continued to howl. Nothing changed except the identities of those accused, who bore the weight of fears too great to be faced otherwise. The werewolf trials were therefore not aberrations, but symptoms of a deeper condition, the fragility of human communities under pressure, and the need to explain the inexplicable in terms that preserved a sense of moral integrity. The spectacle of interrogators demanding confessions of lupine banquets reveals more about the interrogators than about the accused. If anything, it was the judges and chroniclers who seemed most obsessed with dietary details, cataloguing feasts of flesh with a zeal that suggests hunger of another sort. The wolfman became their canvas, allowing them to indulge in morbid imaginings under the guise of justice. The accused, meanwhile, endured the pain of torture until they admitted what everyone already suspected. Justice was less about discovering truth than about satisfying communal hunger for certainty. In the end, the figure of the werewolf in this period stands as a dark reflection of famine itself. Both devoured bodies, both stalked the weak, both dissolved the boundaries of civilization. To call a man a wolf was to name hunger as his essence, to make him the embodiment of that which consumed the community. In killing him, society staged a symbolic victory over famine, even if the next poor harvest would undo it all again. The werewolf was therefore less a myth of individual monstrosity than a collective story about survival, about the line that separates man from beast, and how quickly it erodes when bellies are empty. Even as the courts of France and Germany were still sentencing men to burn for supposed wolfish crimes, a quieter countercurrent began to stir. What had once been understood as evidence of diabolical influence, punished with the fire of the stake or the breaking wheel, now increasingly became an object of diagnosis. Physicians, natural philosophers, and even the occasional lawyer sought to explain away the wolfman, not as a supernatural agent, but as a sufferer of disease, madness, or chemical accident. This did not make the stories any less lurid, but it shifted the terms of discussion from confessional torture to clinical curiosity. In a Europe growing ever more enamoured with science, the werewolf was too persistent to be dismissed entirely, and so it was reinterpreted through the lens of bodily malady. One of the most obvious culprits was rabies. Known since antiquity, the disease spread through the bites of animals, most notoriously dogs and wolves, and produced symptoms that seemed tailor-made to sustain the werewolf myth. The rabid sufferer foamed at the mouth, bit those around him, shunned water, and descended into violent agitation before death. To a community already predisposed to associate wolf attacks with transformation, the sight of a man bitten by a wolf and then himself raving with animalistic fury must have seemed confirmation of the old tales. Here at last was a natural explanation for the wolf man, albeit one no less terrifying. Rabies did not require the devil's pact, only the unlucky bite of a predator. Yet while the medical lens could account for the behaviour, it also blurred the lines further, for rabies transformed a human into something scarcely recognisable. It made the metaphor of becoming wolf all too literal, underscoring just how fragile the boundary of reason and humanity could be. Another candidate was ergot poisoning, produced by a fungus that infected rye and other grains. Ergot contains compounds chemically similar to LSD, and outbreaks of poisoning could induce convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and fits of madness. In regions where bread made from contaminated rye was a staple, entire communities might succumb to mass hysteria or strange physical afflictions. The connection to werewolf lore is not difficult to see. A man or woman raving incoherently, contorting in pain, and convinced of their own transformation into something other than human could easily be woven into the fabric of lupine legend. Ergot also helps to explain the persistence of supernatural accusations during times of famine, when desperate populations consumed spoiled grain out of necessity. The poisoned loaf, in other words, could serve as a chemical midwife to the wolf within. Porphyria, a rare hereditary disease affecting the production of hemoglobin, has also been retrospectively invoked to explain some werewolf cases. Certain forms of porphyria can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight, reddish discoloration of the teeth, and disfiguring lesions of the skin. Those afflicted often avoided daylight and displayed physical features that might have seemed uncanny to their neighbours. Though porphyria is vanishingly rare, it has provided fertile ground for modern speculation about how physical illness could have been read as monstrosity. The afflicted, hiding from the sun and cursed with unsettling appearances, would have been obvious targets for suspicion in communities eager to identify the beast in their midst. While porphyria alone cannot account for the scale of werewolf belief, it illustrates the principle that strange medical conditions were often folded seamlessly into a supernatural framework. Mental illness offered another interpretive avenue. Melancholia, mania, and what was sometimes called clinical lycanthropy, the delusional belief that one had become a wolf, appear in medical treatises from the Renaissance onward. Physicians recorded patients who crawled on all fours, howled, and claimed to crave raw flesh. In some cases, sufferers were chained, beaten, or subjected to exorcism in an attempt to cure them of what was viewed as a spiritual malady. Modern psychiatry might diagnose these cases as severe psychosis, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder, but to early observers, they seemed proof that the wolf could erupt from within. Nothing undermined the dignity of man quite like seeing him abandon speech for howls and diet for carrion. The overlap between madness and lupine behaviour was so striking that lycanthropy became a recognised, if poorly understood, medical term. Yes, madness, poverty and infection were real problems, but it is far tidier to conclude that your neighbour is simply very committed to canine roleplay. It is easier to name his convulsions as proof of wolfish nature than to grapple with the gnawing reality of disease, hunger, or mental collapse. The wolf provided a category that was simple, vivid, and terrifyingly resonant. It may not have been accurate, but it did the job of explaining what otherwise defied explanation. And for communities already steeped in sermons about the devil's beasts, to call the raving lunatic a wolf was to place him in a familiar and morally legible story. As medicine developed, however, the balance shifted. Physicians and natural philosophers increasingly sought to wean society off supernatural explanations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, learned men wrote dissertations attempting to prove that werewolves were nothing more than sufferers of rabies or delusion. Some suggested that wolfmen were simply melancholics who had convinced themselves of their own transformations, their supposed powers being little more than the effects of imagination. Others argued that hallucinations from ergot or madness explained the entire phenomenon, reducing wolfish banquets to fevered delusions. These efforts did not entirely persuade the public. Wolves remained too potent a cultural symbol, but they marked a decisive turn. The wolf was no longer treated solely as an external enemy. It was being dissected as an internal condition. This shift also intersected with the legal world. As courts grew more reluctant to prosecute supernatural crimes in the wake of Enlightenment skepticism, medical testimony provided an escape hatch. A man accused of werewolf behaviour might be declared mad rather than damned, confined to an asylum rather than executed at the stake. The diagnosis of lycanthropy became a way of explaining away confessions once wrung out on the rack. This did not make life easier for the accused, but it did shift their fate from the pyre to the madhouse. In a grim way, the wolf was tamed by bureaucracy, absorbed into the expanding categories of criminality and illness. What we see in these explanations is not so much the eradication of the werewolf as its migration into different registers of thought. The myth proved too resilient to vanish outright. Instead, it was reframed. Rabies turned the werewolf into an unfortunate medical victim. Ergot transformed him into the sufferer of poisoned grain. Porphyria marked him as a hereditary outcast, and mental illness cast him as a patient in need of confinement. Each explanation diminished the supernatural while preserving the fascination. The wolf remained, but he was reinterpreted as a problem for physicians and jurists rather than inquisitors and executioners. Yet even as medicine expanded its claims, popular culture continued to relish the older stories. Pamphlets and ballads did not vanish overnight, and villagers still whispered about beasts in the woods. The rationalist explanations often circulated only among elites, while the popular imagination continued to draw upon centuries of wolf lore. This gap between learned diagnosis and communal fear ensured that the werewolf remained a hybrid figure, half patient, half monster. He could be discussed in medical lectures during the day and whispered about by the fire at night. The tension between these registers kept the myth alive, refusing to let it be neatly confined to either the supernatural or the scientific. The result was a strange coexistence. In the courtroom, the werewolf was increasingly displaced by psychiatric testimony or natural explanations. In the popular imagination, he continued to haunt the forest, his appetite sharpened by famine and fear. The myth had not been destroyed. It had simply changed costume, moving from the stake to the sickbed, from the scaffold to the scholar's study. This evolution reveals both the resilience of the symbol and the adaptability of society in interpreting it. The wolf could be devil, patient, or lunatic, depending on the context, but he could never be fully expelled. By the 18th century, the werewolf was beginning to lose its teeth. The great witch and werewolf trials of the previous 2 centuries had left their mark on Europe, filling archives with confessions and pamphlets with lurid illustrations, but the intellectual mood was shifting. The Enlightenment brought with it a suspicion of superstition and a preference for rational explanation, and the figure of the wolf-man began to look less like a dangerous possibility and more like a provincial embarrassment. The age of courts convicting men for running in the forest with fur belts and ointments was waning. In its place arose the voice of the skeptic, armed with reason and often with an air of disdain for the foolishness of earlier generations. Philosophers and intellectuals used the werewolf as an easy example of credulity, a sign of how ignorance and fear had once clouded human judgment. Voltaire, for instance, made passing remarks about the absurdity of believing in wolfmen, placing such cases alongside witchcraft as evidence of the delusions that superstition imposed upon society. For the philosophes, the werewolf was not a threat but a punchline, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting imagination rule over reason. Trial records that earlier had been treated with grim seriousness were now read with irony, their tortured confessions dissected as examples of hysteria rather than evidence of the devil's power. Where once the scaffold had been the stage, the coffeehouse and lecture hall now provided the setting for discussion, with the wolf reduced to the butt of sceptical wit. This did not mean, however, that the werewolf vanished. In rural Europe, far from the centres of Enlightenment publishing, tales of wolfmen persisted around the hearth. Folklore has a resilience that philosophy rarely destroys, and the stories that had frightened children and explained tragedies were not easily dismissed. In villages where wolves still prowled, the line between superstition and lived danger remained thin. Farmers could scoff at pamphlets but still tell their children not to stray into the woods at dusk lest a wolf, or something worse, be waiting. The intellectual elite might sneer at the superstition, but the countryside continued to feed the myth with whispers, legends, and warnings. It is in this period that the werewolf began to divide into two parallel lives. On the one hand, he survived as folklore, a story passed orally, stripped of the judicial weight he had once carried but still potent as a fireside warning. On the other hand, he became a subject for antiquarians and early folklorists, who collected such tales not because they believed them, but because they wished to preserve them as cultural curiosities. These collectors, part scholars, part romantics themselves, treated the werewolf as an artifact of a vanishing world, a relic of peasant imagination worth cataloguing before it disappeared. The result was that the wolfman no longer stood accused in court, but was instead catalogued in notebooks, placed safely between covers, where his menace could be studied rather than feared. The contrast is striking when set against the ferocity of earlier centuries, where once men like Peter Stubber had been torn apart in the public square for their supposed lupine crimes. Now the wolfman appeared as a quaint story retold in the drawing rooms of collectors or cited in scholarly essays. The transformation was not in the myth itself. Many of the same themes of cannibalism, curses, and nocturnal wanderings persisted, but in its cultural function. No longer was the werewolf a legal category or a theological threat. He had become instead an ethnographic curiosity, a superstition that said more about the credulous poor than about the cosmic struggle between God and devil. To believe in werewolves was to mark oneself as backward, as provincial, as outside the growing circle of enlightened reason. Yet this process was uneven. The wolf's decline as a figure of real fear did not occur uniformly across Europe. In regions where wolves were still a tangible menace, where livestock were attacked and winter nights filled with howls, the association of the wolf with the uncanny lingered stubbornly. In such places, stories of men turning into wolves did not disappear overnight, but slowly lost their sting, becoming tales told with a half smile, warnings repeated more for tradition than conviction. It was a slow erosion rather than an abrupt collapse as belief gave way to memory, and memory to mere habit. The intellectuals of the Enlightenment, meanwhile, were often too eager to congratulate themselves on the death of superstition. They spoke of werewolf trials as though they belonged entirely to a darker past, failing to recognize how close those trials still were in living memory. Their essays and satires positioned the wolfman as the emblem of benighted times, a convenient contrast to the rational brilliance of the present. Nothing reassures an enlightened philosopher quite like pointing to a man once accused of eating his neighbour in wolf form and declaring, "We are better than this." It was an easy target, and therefore irresistible, even if the fears that had sustained those accusations were still not entirely gone from the countryside. In literature too, the werewolf began to change form. Without the urgency of trial records or the sanction of the pulpit, he became available for entertainment. Chapbooks and stories retold the old tales in sensational but detached tones, packaging horror as a consumable thrill rather than a civic or religious crisis. The wolf was declawed by print, reduced from an existential threat to a character in a story. Readers could shiver at the details of his crimes, but close the book afterward with the reassurance that such things belonged to the realm of imagination. This shift in function marked the werewolf's final decline as an object of belief. He no longer walked the forests of Europe in the minds of jurists or priests. He padded instead through the pages of collected folklore, safely corralled by ink. The werewolf thus entered a kind of twilight state. He was not dead, for stories still circulated, but he no longer carried the weight of law or theology. He became what we might call a folkloric husk, a figure preserved out of habit, repeated without conviction, and studied with curiosity rather than terror. his decline reveals the broader transformation of European society in the 18th century, a society increasingly determined to separate the realm of superstition from that of reason. Yet decline did not mean disappearance. Stripped of judicial teeth, the werewolf became newly available for reinvention, a process that would soon unfold in the hands of the Romantics and the Gothic writers who found in his shadow the perfect material for their own cultural needs. By the 19th century, the werewolf had wandered a long way from the forests of Ossory or the scaffolds of Bedburg. No longer a matter for courts or clerics, he now padded into the pages of cheap print, Gothic fiction, and eventually cinema. The Industrial Revolution had given Europe not only railways and factories, but also mass publishing, and with it a new appetite for sensational entertainment. The werewolf, stripped of his judicial terror, was suddenly useful again, repurposed as a character of lurid fascination. Penny dreadfuls, those cheaply produced serials sold for a penny a sheet, found in him the perfect material, a monster with ancient pedigree, frightening enough to sell, but unthreatening enough that readers could shiver in comfort. In these pages, the werewolf ceased to be the neighbour, dragged before a judge, and became instead a grotesque villain or tragic figure, his crime staged for titillation rather than communal exorcism. Gothic literature had already paved the way for such reinvention. The late 18th and early 19th centuries saw writers turning back to medieval ruins, storms, and monsters as settings and symbols for anxieties about modernity. The werewolf fitted seamlessly into this landscape of gloom and spectacle. He could be made to stalk abbeys or prowl desolate moors, serving both as a reminder of Europe's folkloric past and as a metaphor for the animal impulses lurking beneath the polished surface of polite society. In this context, the Wolfman was less about famine or heresy than about suppressed desire, forbidden violence, and the uncanny persistence of the primitive. His tragedy could be staged not in the courtroom, but in the human psyche, where reason warred with bestial instinct. This shift was most visible in the stories that blended horror with pathos, presenting the werewolf as a cursed figure who suffered as much as he terrified. Writers seized on the theme of duality, of man divided against himself, which dovetailed neatly with the Gothic fascination with secret identities, doubles, and hidden corruption. The wolf shape became a metaphor for inner monstrosity, a symbol of passions that could not be contained. It was easier to write a story about a man sprouting fur under the moon than to publish a treatise about repressed desire. Literature made palatable what theology had once condemned, and medicine had once pathologized, wrapping human frailty in a cloak of fur and fangs. By the late 19th century, the werewolf was firmly established as a creature of entertainment. The rise of cheap print, serialized fiction, and eventually pulp magazines ensured that his stories reached wide audiences. He was increasingly joined by a menagerie of other Gothic monsters, vampires, ghosts, and ghouls, each adapted from older folklore, but retooled for modern thrills. The werewolf's reinvention was part of a larger cultural trend in which folklore was commodified, stripped of its judicial and theological weight, and sold back to readers as spectacle. The monster who once embodied famine and fear of wolves was now part of an expanding catalogue of thrills available at the bookstall. It was in the 20th century, however, that the werewolf truly achieved an iconic status. With the rise of cinema, the Wolfman became visible in new and unforgettable ways. Silent films experimented with lupine transformations, but it was Universal Studios' The Wolfman in 1941 that codified much of the imagery now considered essential. Starring Lon Chaney Jr. as the doomed Larry Talbot, the film introduced or popularised motifs that were only loosely connected to earlier folklore. The full moon as the trigger of transformation, the silver bullet as the only true weapon, and the dramatic on-screen metamorphosis from man to beast. These cinematic inventions quickly became canon, overriding centuries of more varied and ambiguous traditions. From then on, the werewolf was inseparable from moonlight, silver, and tortured transformation. The cinematic werewolf also emphasised tragedy. Tolbert is cursed against his will, transformed into a killer he cannot control, and ultimately destroyed. This portrayal resonated with modern audiences because it recast the werewolf as less a monster than a victim of fate, a man undone by forces larger than himself. The audience was invited not only to fear him, but also to pity him, to recognise in his condition the fragility of human identity. In this way, the werewolf of Hollywood was as much a melodramatic symbol as a horror villain, embodying anxieties about modern life, alienation, and the thin veneer of civility. At the same time, the werewolf became fodder for B-movies and cheap thrillers, proliferating in films that delighted in special effects transformations and formulaic plots. He fought vampires, stalked teenagers, and occasionally found himself in settings as improbable as the Wild West or outer space. The sheer abundance of cinematic werewolves reveals both the durability and the malleability of the myth. He could be tragic or ridiculous, terrifying or camp, depending on the needs of the story. Unlike the wolfmen of trials and sermons, who had been bound tightly to theology and law, the cinematic werewolf was infinitely adaptable. His curse could be reinvented endlessly, because it no longer answered to courts or pulpits, but to box office receipts. The codification of the werewolf through film also spread the myth globally. What had once been a distinctly European figure, tied to wolves that haunted forests and famine-haunted villages, now entered the imagination of audiences far removed from those landscapes. Even in countries without native wolf populations, the cinematic wolfman became a familiar monster, imported through reels of film and cheap movie posters. In this way, Hollywood universalized the werewolf, detaching him from his ecological and historical roots and transforming him into a global archetype of monstrosity. Yet even as the werewolf became a pop culture staple, traces of his older heritage persisted. The emphasis on uncontrollable appetite and transformation under pressure still echoed the famine-fueled terrors of earlier centuries. The tragic loneliness of Talbot and his successors carried faint reminders of the cursed families of Ossory or the exiles of Celtic folklore. And the fixation on violence and bloodshed echoed the trial confessions of Stuber and Garnier, albeit in safer fictionalized form. The cinematic werewolf was new, but his features bore the shadows of older fears, refracted through celluloid. The 20th century also saw the werewolf used as metaphor in ways that harked back to his allegorical past. In some stories, he became a stand-in for addiction, rage, or repressed sexuality, his transformation symbolizing urges that could not be controlled. In others, he represented the alienation of modern life, the sense of being trapped in a role one did not choose. Writers and directors found in the Wolfman a versatile vehicle for anxieties that theology and medicine had once attempted to address more directly. The wolf was still with us, but he had become a screen onto which modern fears could be projected. The transformation of the werewolf into a film star says as much about modern society as the trials said about early modern Europe. Once, men were tortured until they admitted to eating children with the aid of magical belts. Now audiences paid good money to watch a man grow fur under studio lights. Both reveal a society eager to consume the spectacle of monstrosity. whether in a courtroom or a cinema. The shift from scaffold to silver screen demonstrates not the disappearance of the myth, but its resilience, its ability to adapt to whatever cultural stage was available. By the late 20th century, the werewolf had become less a symbol of communal fear and more an entertainment commodity, endlessly reinvented for new genres. He appeared in comedies, horror parodies, and even children's cartoons. His once lethal menace softened into familiarity. Yet the very persistence of the character across so many forms suggests that something deeper remained. The wolf continued to embody the fear of losing control, of appetite overwhelming civility, of the beast breaking loose from the cage of the human form. Even in his campiest appearances, he retained a trace of that primal resonance. And so, by the time the century drew to a close, the werewolf had completed a strange transformation of his own. From divine punishment in Arcadia to judicial terror in Germany, from folkloric curse in Ireland to Gothic hero in fiction, he had become at last a cinematic icon, recognisable by tropes that bore only loose resemblance to his origins. The full moon and silver bullet, the tortured man turned beast, the dramatic transformation scene. These were inventions of modern entertainment. Yet they stuck so firmly that earlier versions of the myth seemed forgotten. The wolf had shed one skin after another, but he had never been erased. This raises the enduring question, why does the myth survive at all? Why has the werewolf, once the scapegoat for famine and sin, endured through centuries of reinvention to become a household monster? What is it about the wolf within the man that continues to haunt us long after the last real wolves have been driven from the edges of Europe? These are questions that bring us to the final stage of the story, where the beast reveals itself not as an animal of the forest, but as a mirror of humanity's own fears. The werewolf story stretches across millennia, and in following its trail we can see how myths evolve, in lockstep with human need. What began as ritual and punishment in the ancient world, wolf cults on the margins of Indo-European society, the divine retribution of Lycaon, and the Norse Ulfhedna, became in medieval Europe a theology of danger. The wolf was absorbed into sermons as the devil's beast, while courts and chronicles turned neighbours into scapegoats for famine and misfortune. The 17th century turned wolfmen into defendants. Their supposed cannibalism extracted under torture and burned into the communal memory as proof that the line between man and beast could dissolve at any moment. Enlightenment skepticism then mocked the superstition, medicine diagnosed it, and literature reimagined it, until by the 20th century, the werewolf had become not a matter of survival, but of spectacle, flickering in black and white across cinema screens. From sacred initiation rites to penny dreadfuls, from famine fears to silver bullets, the wolf has always adjusted his coat to match the season, and yet, beneath all these transformations, the werewolf has endured. He has never entirely vanished, never been driven out by skepticism, science, or ridicule. This persistence suggests that he answers to something deeper than circumstance, something primal that refuses to fade. At its core, the werewolf myth is not about wolves at all. It is about the fear of violence, the gnaw of hunger, and the terrifying fragility of the line we draw between civilization and savagery. Wolves were feared predators, yes, but what made them such potent symbols was that their hunger looked so much like our own. They killed in packs, took from the weak, and prowled where hunger drove them. To imagine men as wolves was to acknowledge, if only indirectly, that the same impulses lurked within the human heart. This explains why cannibalism haunts the werewolf story from its earliest iterations. Lycaon served human flesh to Zeus and was punished with a lupine form. Stuber and Garnier confessed to feasting on children in the woods. Pamphlets retold tales of entrails devoured, and limbs torn from bone. Each of these reflects not only the fear of beasts outside the village, but the recognition that hunger could strip away humanity itself. In times of famine, neighbours whispered about cannibalism. The werewolf offered a more palatable explanation. Violence, too, found its metaphor in the wolf. Warriors who donned wolf skins and howled in battle embodied the dream of lupine ferocity, terrifying enemies with their collapse of human restraint. To accuse an enemy of being a wolf was to cast him not merely as opponent, but as predator, dangerous in essence rather than in act. The wolf thus became shorthand for the kind of violence that exceeded ordinary bounds, the frenzy that transformed men into something ungovernable. From Norse Ulfhednar to modern horror films, the theme persists. The man who becomes beast is not simply dangerous, he is unrecognizable, his humanity drowned beneath the jaws of appetite. The enduring power of the werewolf also lies in its exploration of liminality. The wolf has always been a creature of edges, haunting the margins of fields, the borders of forests, the twilight between safety and danger. To imagine a man as wolf was to place him in that same in-between space, neither fully within society nor fully excluded, neither wholly human nor wholly beast. The cursed families of Ossory, condemned to spend years as wolves before returning to human form, exemplified this condition. So too did the tragic heroes of medieval romance, trapped between loyalty and exile, manhood and bestiality. The appeal of these figures lies in their instability, their reminder that identity itself is precarious. The werewolf myth endures because it dramatizes the possibility that anyone might cross the line, that under the right conditions of hunger, madness, or rage, the wolf waits within. It is this theme that modern cinema seized upon with such enthusiasm. Lon Chaney Jr.'s Larry Talbot is less a monster than a man undone, a figure whose tragedy lies in his inability to remain himself. Each transformation dramatizes the fragility of identity, the collapse of reason beneath instinct. Audiences pitied him even as they feared him, because they recognized in his plight the universal dread of losing control. In this sense, the Hollywood werewolf is not so far removed from the wolfmen of famine Europe. Both express the terror of discovering that beneath the surface of the civilized self lies an animal ready to break free. What changes is not the essence of the fear, but the costume. Once the wolf was an explanation for missing children in the forest. Now he is a metaphor for urges that polite society prefers not to name. The werewolf has also survived because he is endlessly adaptable. Unlike other monsters bound to specific contexts, vampires with their aristocratic overtones, mummies with their colonial baggage, the werewolf can be remade to suit any age. He has been divine punishment, martial ferocity, heretical corruption, medical patient, Gothic hero, and cinematic spectacle. In each case, he takes on the anxieties of the moment and reflects them back with uncanny clarity. This plasticity explains why he persists when other figures fade. The werewolf is less a fixed creature than a cultural mirror, reshaped again and again to capture what most frightens us. Yet adaptability does not mean superficiality. What gives the werewolf myth its staying power is the depth of the fears it expresses. Hunger, violence, and loss of control are constants of human experience, and the wolf offers a vivid language for all three. The myth endures because it speaks to anxieties that cannot be exorcised by Enlightenment critique or silenced by skepticism. Rationalists may scoff at the absurdity of believing in shapeshifters, but their laughter does not erase the reality that humans have always feared what they might become under pressure. The wolf's snarl still echoes because it is, in some sense, our own. It is also worth noting that the werewolf persists, in part because he is less abstract than other supernatural figures. Devils, demons, and ghosts inhabit metaphysical realms, but the wolf was and is a real predator. For centuries, wolves roamed Europe's forests, raiding flocks and haunting the night. To imagine a man as wolf was therefore to link the human to something tangible, something heard howling beyond the fields. Even after wolves were exterminated from much of Europe, the memory of their presence remained strong enough to sustain the metaphor. The werewolf myth could survive the death of the animal because the wolf had already become more than an animal. It had become a repository of human fears. As we reflect on this long history, the continuity is striking. From Lycaon's punishment to Stubber's confession, from Celtic curses to penny dreadfuls, the werewolf has always been less about wolves than about humans. The myth allows us to name what we would rather disown: cannibalism in famine, frenzy in war, madness in the village, desire in the city. It offers a language for the moments when humanity cracks and the beast surges through. The form of the myth may change, but the need it serves remains the same. To speak of werewolves is to speak, indirectly, of ourselves. One could say that blaming wolves for our worst impulses is one of humanity's oldest tricks. If a man kills his neighbour in war, he is a hero. If he kills him in hunger, he must be a wolf. If he raves with madness, he's not a lunatic, but a beast in disguise. After all, it is easier to blame the wolf than to admit that humans do the very same thing without the courtesy of fur. The myth persists because it flatters us, allowing us to imagine that atrocity belongs elsewhere, outside the bounds of the human. The wolf becomes a convenient scapegoat, bearing the burden of what we would rather not see in the mirror. In the end, the werewolf is not a creature of the forest but of the human heart. He does not live in caves or moors, but in the stories we tell to manage our own fears. He is a projection, a shadow cast by hunger, violence, and desire. Wolves may vanish from the landscape, and trials may vanish from the courts, but the wolfman endures because he's never really about wolves at all. He's about us, about the fragility of the lines we draw between order and chaos, humanity and savagery, self and other. To speak of werewolves is to speak of the beast within, a beast we cannot kill because it is our own reflection. And so the myth survives, not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror held up to the present, reminding us that the true forest lies within, and that its shadows are not so easily escaped. And so we come to the end of our long walk through the shadows of the werewolf's history. From ancient kings struck down by Zeus, to cursed families wandering as beasts, to villagers whispering of wolfmen in famine winters, and finally to the silver screens of Hollywood. The stories endured because they named hungers and fears that were never banished, only disguised. The wolf has changed its costume many times, but the anxieties it carries remain as familiar as ever. If you'd like to hear more of these slow unravelings into the forgotten costs of history, you can like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another corner of the past you'd like uncovered. For early access, ad-free audio, or to simply support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.